Hello, everyone. Welcome to the new Sibylline webinar on the global fallout of the war in Iran. And my name is Sam Olsen. I'm the chief analyst, and we wish you all a very warm welcome to this slightly depressing but very important webinar. And we've got a very, very good lineup of experts to be able to talk through what's going on. And we will last for about an hour. Thank you very much. Yeah, you see the slides there. This will last for about an hour with a good slug of Q&A at the end. Please do keep your questions to the end. And without further ado, we shall hand over to Noam, who's going to read the first report.
Thank you, Sam, and hello, everyone. I'm going to introduce quickly the current status of the Middle East, talking about the prospects, and then moving on to give to Ed after me to talk about the impacts in the Sub-Saharan Africa. Currently, what we've seen since the beginning of the war, Iran has exerted influence on the Strait of Hormuz through targeting the ships. So far, we've counted about 23 ships or vessels that were hit close to the Strait of Hormuz, and this led to kind of a self-imposed closure. Basically, we've seen ships and companies stopping their sailing into the Strait of Hormuz. And then afterwards, we've seen also that Iran essentially created a toll booth, allowing ships who provide the documentation and sometimes payment to pass through the Strait of Hormuz in a different route around the Larak Island. And to give some numbers in comparison from the same period last year, for example, if we've seen this year between the 1st of March to the 25th of March, about 142 ships transiting or through the Strait of Hormuz. Last year, the same period, we've seen about 2,652. So giving us a bit of the understanding of how big is the disruption. And of course, about 50 or 20%, if you want, of the world crude oil is passing through the Strait of Hormuz. You can see in the graph around you how this disruption also impacts crude oil prices or Brent oil prices. And then in terms of prospects, what we are seeing next, we've seen that been indirect negotiations between the US and Iran the past week and a half. However, we also seen at the same time substantial deployment of additional ground forces into the region. We've seen the 82 Airborne Division, the Boxer Amphibious Strike Group, the USS Tripoli Strike Group, and then commandos like the Rangers, SEALs, and we've seen more and more of those getting or arriving the region in the past week. And this is a highlight for us, the preparation of the United States for a possible failure of those negotiations. And in that regard, what we are seeing in this, if the conflict continues in the same trajectory, this will also increase the risk of Gulf states joining directly to the conflict, as well as U.S. military ground operation, likely trying to exert or gain control over key islands in the Strait of Hormuz. We are talking here mainly the Abu Musa, Greater Tomb, Lesser Tomb as well, Kish Island and Kasham Island as the key areas of control in the Strait of Hormuz. And of course, there is the option of a ground operation against the Harag Island, which will exert more pressure on Iran to go for negotiations. With those in mind, we also have seen in the past weekend a new development of the Houthis, the Iran-backed Houthis, announcing that they are joining the fight, targeting Israel. So far, we haven't seen them targeting the Bab el-Mandeb, the other choke point of the oil trade in the world. However, this will increase in likelihood as the conflict continues, and even the implicit threat of closure of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait already increase premiums, insurance premiums, and will further increase impact oil prices and commodity prices. In terms of the disruption that how long Iran can continue with that, it's essentially Iran can continue that at least several months, if not even more. What we are seeing in that regard that you don't need to be constantly targeting ships in the Strait of Hormuz in order to cause disruption. It's enough to target once 3 days, once 4 days, very little effort, but causing a lot of disruption. So those are the things that we are seeing right now, with a big preparation for a bigger escalation in the coming week, in the event or the possible event that uh, negotiations will fail. I'm now happy to move and give the stage to Edward to add.
Thank you, Noam. So looking at sub-Saharan Africa, Africa is highly exposed to sort of the associated oil price spikes that have come from the effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz, particularly as the overwhelming majority of states across the region are net oil importers, and they're also heavily dependent on oil for power generation. What's sort of compounding this is that several states have very limited or virtually no strategic reserves, so they're sort of immediately thrust into these pressures. And another factor is that many of these states have very little budgetary capacity. They're already running very tight budgets, or even several states running budget deficits. So that sort of undermines their capacity to procure oil from other sources. One sort of implication of this is that states are going to see intense pressure on their foreign currency reserves, likely sort of triggering depreciation across several regional currencies in the coming weeks. This also means that because these states have very low foreign currency reserves, it means that they have little capacity to deploy their reserves to sort of defend their exchange rate. So this is going to drive sort of subsequent inflationary pressures in the coming weeks. But more importantly, it's going to really intensify debt distress pressures across the region and increase the likelihood of states defaulting on their debt in the coming months, particularly as much of the region's debt is denominated in USD. So as soon as these regional currencies depreciate as a result of these spikes, it drives up the cost of repayments and sort of repayment obligations, and then, as I say, increase the risk of default in the coming months. States sort of particularly exposed to these pressures, we flagged that Malawi and Ethiopia have extremely limited currency reserves, so they're going to really struggle to defend their currency. But we're also seeing other countries like Senegal, Zambia, Kenya, and Mozambique are likely to face increased pressure and likelihood of debt default in the coming weeks. So then, in addition to sort of macroeconomic impacts, we're also seeing a huge impact for energy security across the region as well. Because in addition to importing oil from the Gulf, a lot of sub-Saharan African states are dependent on the Gulf for fuel imports or from sort of other sources that transit the strait, where they also have these similar issues of a lack of strategic reserves that are driving shortages across the region, and several states have implemented rationing measures already. We've seen states like Ethiopia, South Africa, Kenya, Namibia. There are several others as well, and more likely in the coming weeks. But ultimately, these measures are going to be unlikely to sort of moderate the overall impact on energy security from sort of protracted disruption in the Strait of Hormuz. One other issue we've seen as well is that several states are now planning or already have increased fuel subsidies or are cutting fuel duties to try and sort of shield consumers from these price increases. And some states like Kenya, this is with no doubt elections in mind in the coming months. But ultimately, these policies are only really going to compound the issue of fuel availability. And this also means that, you know, with sustained price rises, it's going to really drain regional budgets and exacerbate the sort of debt issues that I already touched upon. This is also obviously going to have huge supply chain implications, particularly for the landlocked states that are dependent on overland transit for their goods to then be exported at regional ports, but also for heavy fuel consuming industries across the region, particularly sort of mining and manufacturing. And then one other issue with this as well is for businesses based in countries that have sort of existing energy security concerns that are likely dependent on auxiliary generators. They're also going to have issues finding supplies for that. So that's can affect a more broad range of sectors as well as sort of hospitality, broader financial services. Then sort of flagging briefly two specifics sectors that are facing acute pressures. So one is critical mineral mining, specifically sort of the mining of cobalt, copper, lithium, and nickel, because they're all dependent on sulfur or sulfuric acid in the extraction process. Now, 90% of Africa's sulfur imports come from the Gulf. Oh, sorry, transit through the Strait of Hormuz. And what that means is that with limited storage capacity and production capacity, we're likely to see shortages at mining sites and disruptions at mining sites across the region. Even once the strait has reopened, residual disruption is likely to last several weeks. And in the events that mines have had to shut down as a consequence of these shortages, it's going to take weeks to then sort of restore full operational capacity. And then another sector as well that is particularly facing acute pressures is fertilizer and sort of the implications that has for the agricultural sector. So not only is sulfur a key ingredient in fertilizer, but also many sub-Saharan African states direct import fertilizer directly from the Gulf. So we're already seeing shortages and price spikes across the region. Another issue as well is that several states have subsidy programs, fertilizer subsidy programs, but due to the sort of budgetary pressures that are likely to come from this crisis, we're likely to see these being drawn down. What this ultimately is going to mean is that seeing reduced application rates, and ultimately that's going to feed into crop yields in the coming seasons. Where this is likely to be most acute is East Africa, which is currently undergoing its planting season. And those issues there are a particular concern given the sort of entrenched drought and food security pressures that we've seen across that region for several months.
Right. Are you done, Ed?
Sorry, yes, I am.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much for that. Right, next slide, please, Karen. Aidan.
Thanks very much, Sam. So to cover the Asia Pacific, and we got similar stresses to Sub-Saharan Africa in many ways. Also very reliant on imported energy, particularly from the Strait. And so the closure of the Strait of Hormuz is the main driver of the impact in Asia. About 60% of oil needs and about a third of LNG passed through the Strait in terms of Asia's needs. So huge impact, particularly on prices, but also increasingly supply. In terms of impact on the ground, however, at least in the short term, there is a lot of variety in the region, as some countries are more resilient than others, more prepared. On one side, for example, you have China, which has been planning for external shocks such as this for a long time, has diversified its energy sources, has built a lot of renewable energy capacity in, and has also built up significant strategic reserves of oil in the past couple of years, thanks to discounted oil from Russia, Iran, and Venezuela. So they are able to mitigate at least the short-term impacts without as much disruption on the ground. However, other countries such as Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, lower income countries, they don't have the fiscal capacity to buy fuel at the highest prices, the higher prices that we're seeing now in the spot market. They don't have as much domestic production or falling domestic production in some cases. Don't have the alternative sources of energy to as much degree, and also lack the strategic reserves. So they are having to take more immediate actions, more immediate addressing measures, such as Sri Lanka introduced a public holiday every Wednesday, as well as fuel rationing. And the public is also feeling it at a sharper degree, given already existing cost of living pressures. But saying that, the longer this goes on, the less countries will be able to mitigate the risk, mitigate the impact on the public, particularly even the countries that are more resources, more particularly financial resources or reserves. Countries like Japan, which has a lot of strategic reserves and has the financial capacity to buy energy at higher prices, however, doesn't have domestic sources of energy to enough degree if the Strait of Hormuz stays closed for an extended period. And so there's going to be impact on various industries, particularly ones that are more fuel intensive. And that's going to be felt in the coming months. One thing that they do have, I think, compared to, for example, the 2022 energy crisis that hit Europe following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is that there is more coal capacity to leverage, and there's more free or available coal capacity. So that should help many countries in the region, at least from an electricity generation point of view. But overall, they're still very reliant on petroleum and refined petroleum from the Gulf, and so we're going to still be very heavily impacted. Looking elsewhere outside of energy, many chemicals and other supplies come from the Middle East and from via the Strait. Chemicals such as naphtha are vital in producing plastics such as polyethylene or polypropylene, which are used in huge amount of industrial purposes, making packaging, medical equipment, automotive components, and the shortage of such chemicals and the higher prices will drive higher costs and disruption to associated industries, particularly as Asia Pacific has become such a key area for global supply chains in recent decades, which has helped it grow at the pace that we've seen. And again, similar to sub-Saharan Africa, Asia Pacific is also relying on the Middle East for sources for fertilizer, from imports of ammonia, urea, for example, help produce fertilizer. And so the higher prices and a reduced supply again will have a knock-on impact on agricultural production in the region and upcoming harvests. Particularly when you consider that there's potentially an El Nino phenomenon and an El Nino pattern forecast potentially for the end of the year. Could even be a very strong El Nino. And for the Asia Pacific, at least, El Nino brings hotter weather, drier weather, conditions that are already not particularly conducive to high levels of agricultural production. So the concern is, along with the higher costs and the lower supply of fertilizer, if we have unsuitable climate and weather conditions for agriculture, we're going to have particularly concerning food security issues later in the year and next year, which will also exacerbate the inflation and the cost of living pressures that the closure of the Strait and the increasing energy prices was already driving in the region. So I think the combined impact is something to be concerned about in the longer term, even if we have a relatively soonish resolution to the issue in the Strait. And then finally, just to touch on what countries may be doing in response to the issue in the Middle East itself, the conflict, and particularly China. There's much talk about what's China's role, what's the impact on China, what China could be doing. From their perspective, they of course, while they are one of the better countries better positioned in the region to mitigate the impact, there's still a huge impact on them, particularly if this drags on. They're still a huge importer of energy, and they don't want the instability in the global economy as they rely on markets to export. They're still reliant on exports to drive their economy to a large extent, and so the instability doesn't suit their purposes. There's also they of course have relationship with Iran and this current Iranian regime. They would be willing to work with a different Iranian regime. They're very pragmatic with their foreign relations. However, if the Iranian regime was to be replaced by an overtly pro-US regime, I think that would be not in China's interest and something they would try to avoid happening. Saying that, they're going to take a risk-adverse stance to this, limit the impact on them as a priority, particularly in relation to energy. And we've seen that with reported, though not publicly announced, restrictions on exports of fuel, which will have knock-on effects for the region. And it shows that the priorities is damage limitation. And I think that as a result, they'll be very cautious to get particularly involved in the situation, particularly as while they do have ties with Iran, they have ties with all the countries in the region, as they have diversified their energy sources and their relationships in the Gulf. And so it's not just a question of supporting Iran at no cost. So I think they while they would maybe try to facilitate some sort of solution, I don't think they will take much risk or offer too much of an active role in that, particularly as the situation remains so volatile at the moment. So that's a quick summary about the impact on Asia Pacific and what it might be doing. And I'm going to pass it on to Karan now.
Thank you, Aidan. And yes, I will. Just moving to the next slide. Yeah. So yeah, so on the Europe-Eurasia desk, we're also monitoring some of the the spillover of the impact of the war in the Middle East from an economic perspective that I will be touching upon, and then I will pass on to the floor to Annabel Volker, who will run us through some of the more security threats and security implications resulting from this conflict, especially for Europe. So what we see across Europe and Eurasia is that the war is clearly reshaping both sides of the commodity supply chain. So on one side, we have Russia, for instance, in Eurasia, which is a major exporter of energy and other commodities such as fertilizers, which clearly benefits from this conflict. And by contrast, Europe, which is a net importer of much of these commodities, is clearly very vulnerable to the rising cost, to the major supply chain disruptions, which have also knock-on impacts on inflation and the cost of living. So if we look into one of the key commodities that is affected, of course, is oil, and the war in the Middle East is clearly given Russia a short-term economic boost. We've seen that at higher oil prices and the growing and also shifting global demand, especially because of the disruption to key producers in the Middle East, have made Russia an emerging actor, especially as it was under significant sanctions so far. Given the major disruption, even the US has had to agree to temporary sanction waivers, allowing Russian oil that has already been loaded onto vessels to not be affected by the sanctions. So this is clearly showing that Russia, providing Russia with the opportunity to sell more oil, with some estimates indicating that Russia could be receiving around 8.5 billion US dollars per month additionally, and on this, approximately 5 billion US dollars would be going directly to the state budget. So Russia is clearly benefiting from a financial perspective to the point that it has revised and it has dropped plans to cut budget spending very recently over the past week. When it comes to the broader implications for Russia and the Russia-Ukrainian war, this is going to facilitate Russia's war financing. More broadly, knowing that even prior to this conflict, when sanctions were still in place, and Russia was still able to sustain financially the war, at least throughout the next 12 months. But the latest developments and the increased oil revenue means that this was going to further facilitate Russia's defense spending. So when we go back now to the demand side, especially in Europe, the impact is going to be quite significant, because Europe is a key importer of various fuels, and this is going to, for instance, have a major impact on inflation, with lately the March inflation having risen up to 2.5% from around 1.9% in February, and this is largely driven by the surge in energy costs. We're not talking about only oil, but also LNG, given that especially after the war, the start of the Russia-Ukrainian war in February 2022, the EU has steadily reshaped its energy policy to wean off Russian gas via pipelines and to import much more liquid natural gas. And this means that the European energy model is much more vulnerable to major supply chain shocks as the one that is unfolding at the moment. So rising inflation will, of course, have a social impact in the coming months. And overall, this is going to be the inflation is also going to be impacted by another aspect of this conflict as Ed already mentioned, is the disruption to fertilizers, for instance. Europe is also entering the active fertilizing planting season precisely. And therefore, we can see already over here in the visual that, for instance, Europe is quite reliant on global supply chains when it comes to major non-EU exporters, and this also includes Russia. So throughout 2025, Russia accounted for 22% of imported fertilizers, but the EU has imposed in August 2025 some tariffs on Russian fertilizers, but according to the latest data from 2026, Russia still accounts for around 15% of fertilizers. But Russia has also recently imposed some restrictions on an export ban on various components that are used for fertilizers, which is also going to have an impact on the access and to Europe's access to fertilizers, but also the global prices of fertilizers. And the rising cost of fertilizers will have a long-term effect on food prices, especially once after the upcoming harvest season, which will more or less end in fall. And this will have longer-term impact on not only inflation, but also social stability, combined with what I said earlier, the rising energy prices. And of course, should the war against Iran protract a couple of weeks more, this is going to compound most of the issues that I've highlighted so far. But that's pretty much a wrap up when it comes to the economic and energy issues we're observing in Europe and also in Eurasia. I'll pass on the floor to Annabelle to run us through some of the security implications.
Yeah, thanks, Kran, and hi, everybody. So just for context, Iranian intelligence agencies, most notably the IRGC and affiliated actors, have established networks to orchestrate intimidation and espionage operations across Europe, as demonstrated by numerous attacks and attack plots that we saw across Europe since the outbreak of the Israel-Hamas war in 2023, primarily targeting Iranian dissidents, Israeli and Jewish institutions or businesses. But notably, since the 8th of March, there has been a significant uptick in low-impact attacks targeting Jewish and US-linked institutions across Europe, primarily in the Benelux region, but also in the UK and Norway. All of these have been rudimentary attacks employing small explosive devices or arson, which have resulted in limited material damage and no injuries. Whilst there is still very little information on who the attacks can be attributed to from European intelligence agencies and police forces, the timing, the tactics, and the targets of these recent incidents indicate a strong likelihood that they are being linked to Iranian intelligence agencies who've likely intensified their intimidation and espionage campaigns following the outbreak of conflict in the Gulf region. Most notably, a previously unknown Islamist group named Harakat Ashab al-Yamin al-Islama, otherwise going by the acronym HAI, has claimed responsibility for at least 6 attacks, though there is very, very little information at this time on the group, and authorities have yet to verify whether the attacks can be attributed to them. We assess the likelihood that that the group is linked to Iran primarily for 2 reasons. Firstly, being the name, which roughly translates to the Islamic movement of the Companions of the Righteous, and the insignia used in the videos of responsibility posted online have strong parallels with Iran-backed Shiite terror groups, including the Iraqi Kataib Hezbollah. And the videos which have been picked up have been circulating on Telegram channels and discourse channels with links to Iran's so-called axis of resistance. whilst the videos are trying to mimic videos of responsibility used by these established militant organizations, the rudimentary methods of the attacks, including the homemade incendiary devices, as well as irregularities in the text, including Arabic language errors, indicate that this is unlikely a sophisticated threat actor, and it is either an opportunistic cell of radicalized individuals or a front for attacks conducted via established violence as service networks in Europe, which have been employed by both Russian and Iranian actors in recent years to conduct sabotage and espionage operations in Europe. Reinforcing this assessment is the fact that the majority of the suspects who have been detained have been minors, who have been recruited via social media platforms, likely in exchange for modest cryptocurrency payments, and who have been more exposed to violent extremist content given their age and activity on social media. Regardless of the nature of the group, the dispersed and sporadic nature of its operations does pose a complex monitoring challenge for European intelligence agencies, despite their proven ability to mitigate more complex Iranian proxy plots in Europe. So our assessment is that whilst we are unlikely to see this group conducting any sophisticated terror plots resulting in mass casualties, they are likely to continue to attempt to carry out these lower intensity attacks against Jewish institutions, but also the fact that the group has claimed to have attacked the Bank of New York Mellon in Amsterdam, and also posted a video identifying the Bank of America office in Paris prior to the foiled plot we saw several days ago, does indicate an elevated risk that the group will possibly try to attack US financial services, as well as possible European financial services with perceived links to Israeli and US economic interests or military operations in the Gulf region. Quickly, before I wrap up, we've also seen an elevated risk of Iran-backed espionage operations against European defense sites, most notably highlighted by the detainment of an Iranian national who tried to enter HM Naval Base Clyde, otherwise known as Faslane, which is based in Scotland and houses UK nuclear submarines. So moving forward, we'll likely see continuation of this lower intensity intimidation campaign, unless we see either an escalation of conflict in the Gulf region or increased European support for US and Israeli initiatives. But I'll pass back to Sam.
Great, many thanks. So I think that who's next then? Who do we have next then?
It's me, Sam.
Great, thanks, Claire. Thank you. Over to you.
Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. My name is Claire Brady, and I'm going to take us through a whistle-stop tour of the Americas, which are facing risks not unique to the rest of the world that we've just heard. But to start in Latin America, some specific socioeconomic risks present in this part of the world. First and foremost is that rising oil prices will increase the cost of living and drive business profitability concerns, specifically for Andean, Caribbean, and Central American states, which are heavily reliant on oil imports for electricity generation and transport fuel due to the fact that they have limited domestic energy production capabilities. In these states, this will possibly strain government spending and therefore drive inflation and place pressure on foreign currency reserves in the short to medium term. As well, the situation could pronounce already high currency liquidity constraints and elevated inflation rates in countries such as Argentina, Bolivia, and the Caribbean islands. Specifically the transport sector, so looking at aviation, maritime shipping, and overland logistics, will likely face the highest profitability squeezes as a result of these increasing costs. Specifically the overland logistics intensive sectors, such as mining and agricultural industries. In this case, depending on how elevated costs become and how long this conflict protracts, the risk of domestic unrest will also increase, if governments attempt to reduce energy and or fuel subsidies as part of wider cost-cutting measures. And this risk is particularly present in oil-producing countries with traditionally high fuel subsidies, such as Argentina, Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, and Venezuela. Now, again, similar to the rest of the world, this region is also very influenced by fertilizer prices, and rising fertilizer prices will significantly increase financial risks for the agriculture and extractive sectors in the coming months. Now, here, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, and Paraguay face the greatest risk of disruption. Particularly, I want to highlight Brazil, given that it imports around 85% of its fertilizer needs, of which 41% transits through the Strait of Hormuz. And we assess that such disruption will increase further if shipping restrictions and elevated prices persist through Q3 of this year, given that corn and soy planting seasons in the Southern Hemisphere typically begin in September. Now, the majority of Latin America and the Caribbean's fertilizer originates from China, North America, and Russia, so these routes circumvent the Strait of Hormuz. However, the region's accessibility to these products is still highly dependent on the ability of those aforementioned countries and their capacity to sustain production and import, so it will all have a knock-on effect. Similarly, as some other regions have noted, the mining industry will likely face elevated disruption while the strait remains closed, given that sulfuric acid is a key component which travels through the strait and is very important in the copper and lithium mining industries. So particularly these sectors in Chile will likely face increasing costs in the short to medium term. Now, looking at the region a little wider, of course, the war has exposed global supply chain vulnerabilities, and that has only increased the importance of alternative distribution networks. So it is worth a couple quick notes on the most important waterway for the Americas, which is, of course, the Panama Canal. Since late March, the Panama Canal has increased the number of vessels permitted to transit the waterway due to heightened demand and is now operating at maximum capacity. Authorities are also preparing to increase the number of dedicated slots for LNG tankers to transit the canal to 1 per day, which is a pretty big increase from the previous average of 4 per month amid global energy shortages. Now, while the canal is highly likely to be able to facilitate this additional LNG transit in the short term, this is unlikely to offset the wider economic implications of the war and bring down gas prices quickly. So those risks will still persist, even though the canal is operating smoothly. Of course, another thing to note is that increasing the number of dedicated LNG tanker slots will possibly come at the expense of container cargo moving through the Panama Canal. So as long as the war is prolonged, this will also elevate supply chain disruption risks for container cargo specifically. Finally, moving on to North America, of course, the region the US and Canada, I'm speaking of, are also facing higher oil prices, but given these are net exporters of oil, these countries are at less of a risk as the rest of the world. However, I do really want to point out the risks of attacks and terror threats in North America due to this conflict. Immediately after the first strikes, the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security in the US entered a state of high alert for a potential retaliatory attack on US soil, and they have stayed at a high alert ever since. To give a couple of examples, on March 11th, the FBI warned California that they were at a particular risk of drone attacks sponsored by Iranian-supported actors. And on March 12th, there were 2 incidents. The FBI opened a terrorism investigation into a shooting at a university in Virginia because the shooter had previous ties to the Islamic State. And also on the same day, a Lebanon-born U.S. citizen rammed his truck into a synagogue in Detroit, Michigan. And it has now come out that the FBI has said this was inspired by the tactics used by Hezbollah. So these examples highlight the breadth of the threat landscape in North America right now. And while a part of this is the threat of state-sponsored sleeper cells or adversarial attacks, the US and Canadian authorities are largely capable of mitigating such plots. In both nations, the much more likely terrorist attack scenario is radicalized and opportunistic lone offenders, just from those nations. And in these opportunistic cases, there is usually very little intelligence forewarning. But we know that attack risks are elevated for institutions associated with the US government, the military, Israel, Judaism, and especially in urban centers that house extensive Jewish and/or Israeli communities. I particularly want to highlight a couple cities that have both sizable Jewish and Israeli communities and Arab and Muslim communities, as this intersection can be a driver of risk. So looking at New York City, LA, Chicago, Washington, D.C., Toronto, and Montreal. One final note, in the US, we have seen the war drive a small uptick in anti-war activism. However, beyond the opening weekend, there has been very little events focused exclusively on the war in Iran. And instead, this conflict has compounded on already high anti-government sentiment and has also driven some more attendance at pro-Palestine rallies, rather than creating a new standalone movement. So the reputational risks that the private sector faces are very similar to those that it already faced before the conflict started. So as always, those associated most closely with the Trump administration and the defense sector will still be at risk of targeted activism in the coming days and weeks. And with that, I will hand it off to Denise to round out this presentation.
Thank you so much, Claire. I'll be taking us through the kind of cyber side of the war and kind of looking at its impact both on the region and on a more global scale. So starting with sort of regional state-led cyber activity escalation, since the onset of the Israel-US-Iran war, Iran-linked threat actors have increased cyber attacks on technical equipment, specifically internet-connected security cameras in the region to tailor retaliatory attacks. With the aim of kind of amplifying physical attacks and their impact. This uptick specifically has spanned cameras based in Bahrain, Cyprus, Kuwait, Lebanon, Qatar, and the UAE as well. And it consolidates Iran's cyber strategy that has consistently increased this type of cyber activity in line with geopolitical escalation, specifically over the last 12 months. And it also highlights Iran's war tactical use of cyber operations during this war. Also to note, with this point, the kind of state-mandated internet blackout has reduced internet connectivity within Iran. However, it is likely that Iranian state groups do retain some ability to conduct cyber attacks themselves, but have also relied on sort of external cyber activity as well from hacktivists and cybercriminal groups, as we will see in a little while. We've also mentioned the use of malicious mobile applications as well, which have kind of aimed to fragment communication systems. We've seen this since the beginning of the war, both in Israel and Iran, and have kind of disrupted those communications, including, for example, warnings for incoming missile strikes and also the identification of shelter locations as well. So kind of showing the impact on physical security and kind of creating that uncertainty among citizens as well. Moving on to hacktivism, which has taken on quite a prominent role as well since the beginning of the war. Approximately 60 distinct threat groups have actually claimed attacks on US-aligned entities since the beginning of the current conflict, and this has included pro-Iran, pro-Palestine, and pro-Russia hacktivist groups. The attacks have included distributed denial of service attacks, website defacement, and also data leak operations that have primarily targeted IT systems in US-aligned countries as kind of a reactive and also punitive measures against adversaries. Doxing attacks have also occurred and have targeted primarily Iranian influencers from the diaspora that are based in the US or Canada. And this has also included surveillance and data theft attacks on dissidents, journalists, and opposition groups worldwide. So we can kind of see that reactive nature of the attacks that have taken on a more global scale. Moving on to a different type of hacktivist attack, which is destructive cyber attacks, which I'm also sure some of you may be familiar with. At the beginning of the month, a pro-Palestine group that has alleged ties to Iran targeted the global medical device manufacturer Stryker in a destructive cyber operation. The attack wiped data from more than 200,000 devices and resulted in the disruption of ordering systems and services across at least 79 countries worldwide. The attack is notable as it marked the first high-impact spillover cyber incident that stems from the ongoing war. And while we do assess that Iranian state actors likely continue to focus on the war on the ground, this incident does underscore that risk of kind of future program hacktivist attacks on US-aligned entities that are of a more kind of disruptive and destructive nature as well. So that leads us nicely to the kind of next point, which is a supply chain disruption. So particularly talking about this attack that I've just mentioned, as a result of the attack in the UK, the National Health Service was forced to adopt controlled demand management to ensure stock availability for specifically 6 lines of products that are supplied by Stryker. As of the 26th of March, so just a few days ago, Stryker had contained the incident. The company had also resumed manufacturing alongside kind of clearing its order backlog that was caused by the attack. However, on the same day, the NHS also warned that short-term disruption remains possible as it is unclear which sites have resumed operations and whether this has a kind of direct impact on the affected equipment. So that sort of highlights the sort of impact on the supply chain. And to conclude this section, while similar attacks are less likely compared to kind of low impact disruptive attacks that I mentioned earlier, like DDoS and data leak operations, they do remain a possibility, and they thereby increase the risk of further supply chain disruption for US-aligned entities stemming from those cyber operations. The last point that I wanted to touch on is kind of more the spillover impact on broader cyber activity as well that stems from the war. So looking at cybercrime, various cybercriminal groups have actually aligned cyber attacks with warring parties, whether that's to possibly support state objectives or to capitalize on the war to grow their reputation. One notable example is a new cybercriminal group that is suspected to be affiliated with the Iranian state that has kind of resumed cyber activity in March by targeting the Middle Eastern energy sector in data theft cyber operations. So the group specifically infiltrates third-party vendors in the energy sector's supply chain to then exfiltrate strategic information. And so we assess that it's possible that the group is actually cooperating with Iranian state actors to then kind of pass on that strategic intelligence and then inform retaliatory actions and attacks, as we mentioned at the beginning of this section. And lastly, to conclude, a Chinese state-sponsored group was actually observed targeting Qatari military and energy sectors in a cyber espionage operation as well since the beginning of the war. And we do assess that China is likely seeking to continue kind of gathering intelligence on these sectors and the most affected sectors amid kind of growing regional instability. But most importantly, this sort of highlights the possibility for increased kind of external state-sponsored cyber activity that then targets the sectors in the region. That's everything though from the cyber side, so I'll pass it back on to Sam or Claire for the Q&A, I think.
Great, thank you very much. So a very comprehensive roundup of what we have seen. what we are seeing across the world and the impacts on the world from the war. So I think we're going to start off with some Q&A now, and just see if there's anything in the chat. At the moment, nothing. Claire, have you got anything?
No, I cannot see anything, but I can ask some questions if that would be helpful.
I think that would be very helpful. You ask one and I'll ask a few. So, who do you want to ask first?
I can direct this one, I think maybe to you and to Aiden. I think I've gotten a lot of questions just from American colleagues, and I think a lot of people are wondering, does China see all of this distraction and pulling of US resources away from the Asia Pacific region, as any type of opportunity to make moves on Taiwan? Or is this, changing its calculations towards Taiwan? I think that's something that's on a lot of people's minds.
So Aidan, I'll start off with the strategic side, then I'll hand over to you for your specific thoughts on Taiwan. But strategically, this is in many ways a very good opportunity for China, and for a number of reasons. One is that America is expending thousands and thousands of munitions, and which obviously been in the news. But what's really important to note is that America does depend on China for its ability to rearm. Such is the grip of China over the American military supply chain that in effect it is only possible for America to rearm and its advanced weaponry with China's acquiescence. And we are already seeing, and have done for a little bit of time now, a slowdown in certain defense areas as China's unofficial rare earth and critical mineral expert slowdown kicks in. And so America is expending its cupboards, but has limited ability without China's help to be able to restock those cupboards. And obviously that tilts the military balance more towards China's point. But that's really important as well because the Gulf states and many countries in the region rely on American military technology to be able to defend themselves. And as and when their cupboards start going empty, they will be asking and are asking America for resupply, but America only has limited stocks, and as I said, they can't necessarily do much to accelerate that. And so it is likely that China will be a net recipient in terms of increased interest, not only in terms of sort of economic ties, but also in military ties as well. So I think if you're in Beijing, you don't want this to happen in many ways because of the economic shock. And this is undoubtedly having an economic shock on China, as Aidan touched on. But actually, strategically, this is undermining American leadership in the region for sure. When it comes to Taiwan specifically, over to you, Aidan. Do you want to say a few words on that?
Sure. So in terms of their long-term strategy, and I think their preference for a non-kinetic unification of Taiwan, I don't think that's necessarily changed. And like Sam mentioned, while there's certainly risks to the current situation, particularly to the economy, there's strategic opportunities here. And I don't think they're short-windowed strategic opportunities necessarily. And as Sam mentioned, these spent munitions are not something that's going to come back tomorrow. And the whole situation, in a lot of ways, helps China's narrative in terms of its position towards Taiwan, in terms of the US is not a reliable partner to Taiwan, security partner, not just Taiwan, but also its other security partners in the region, such as Japan, the Philippines, and they will be leveraging that, I think, as more of a priority, a lower risk effort to try and achieve its longer term aims and undermine Taiwan's stance, undermine those in Taiwan who want closer relations with the US compared to those in Taiwan who are more pro engagement for China for example. But saying that, there's always I think the risk or the uncertainty that comes with China's decision making is increasingly centralized around Xi Jinping, and I don't think anyone can confidently say they know exactly what his priorities are vis-a-vis fiscal domestic political security or his desire to unify Taiwan. But at the moment, I think they'll be trying to limit risks to themselves and manage those while also trying to seek out those small wins and where the opportunities open up, but not necessarily expecting or forecasting or seeing signs that there's immediate signs that there's China's preparing for some overt actions towards Taiwan. But again, we're living in a very volatile environment right now, and it's important not to be complacent about that.
Great. So if you do want to ask a question, and we've got a bit of time left, please do ask it in the chat. But in the meantime, let's go over to Denise and talk some more about cyberside. There'll be people here looking at the recent activity in terms of hacktivism and the cyber breaches we've had. So Denise, can you just give us a bit more detail about some of the sort of trajectories you think might happen in the coming weeks and months in terms of activism, and are we seeing any signs that Western governments, are trying to stay ahead of the curve to be able to support businesses in this more volatile cyber environment?
Yeah, so I think looking ahead, what we've learned actually from this war is that Iran's cyber capabilities are actually more sophisticated than we had anticipated, both from the perspective of the state, but also in terms of hacktivism. Again, I think Handala, which is the group that targeted Stryker, is the one that's kind of come up in the headlines on multiple occasions. And it's important to kind of note that the FBI, I think a few days ago, actually tied this group to the Iranian state. So that, again, kind of starts to show us the sort of cyber ecosystem as well, and what that looks like and what the capabilities are on the side of Iran. So looking ahead, I think we'll definitely see more pro-Iran hacktivist operations. As I mentioned earlier, the large majority of these will focus on lower impact operations. So those kind of DDoS attacks, which we have seen kind of an uptick in, but it really just also does highlight the fact that we need to focus on the supply chain as well. I don't want to alarm anyone by saying that destructive cyber operations will become kind of the MO of these actors, but they do remain a possibility, and they really very much highlight those supply chain risks. Looking at the UK, for instance, which obviously was affected from the point of view of the health service from this attack, there is obviously an effort with, the resilience bill in terms of kind of securing that supply chain, as we're really starting to see the impact of cyber operations on this. But whether we're kind of at a point where we're effectively able to secure that, I don't really think we are, but I think it kind of shows a more, I guess, a starting point and kind of having a bit more of a comprehensive view of how cyber operations affect operational continuity and the supply chain. At least a starting point in that, even though there's definitely ways to go before we can actually really fully secure our environments and preserve like operational continuity fully as well.
Thanks. And I'll ask a very similar question to Annabelle. Annabelle, are we seeing any Western governments taking a more proactive stance on protecting businesses against extremists? Are we seeing any sort of top line intervention to try and prevent a lot of the security threats that are coming their way?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, European intelligence agencies are very well placed to detect sophisticated attack bots targeting a vast array of institutions, including Western businesses. Notably, taking the example from Paris the other day, as I mentioned, Harry posted in advance a video identifying Bank of America in Paris as a potential target as a result of its links to Israeli and so-called Zionist initiatives. So that's kind of very much mimicking the Islamist rhetoric that we've seen. So in response to that, we likely saw an increased police presence outside the office, which then resulted in French police forces being able to detain the suspects on the scene as they were about to detonate the device. So that shows how, when it comes to the security threat in Europe, regular kind of just augmented security presences near prominent targets will most likely mitigate any form of direct security threat. And we've also seen, just on the topic of security presence, we've seen European countries, in affected countries where we've seen attacks, implement increased security around Jewish institutions, Israeli businesses. Notably in Belgium, they've deployed soldiers to 20 synagogues across the capital, Brussels and Antwerp. So that just highlights some of the security response that we've seen from European governments.
Great, thank you very much. So do we have, and we've got a question here. Does the team foresee any potential impact on the US midterm elections? Is there an increased likelihood of Trump declaring a unilateral victory to limit blowback ahead of the election in November? Obviously, this is one for you, Claire.
Yes, I mean, the short answer is absolutely. This is going to have major impacts on the midterm elections. No matter what's happening in the world, the number one issue for voters is always how the economy is performing and how they are feeling the impacts of that in their daily lives. So the fact that gas prices are through the roof, higher, the highest they've been since, I believe, 2022 at this point in the US. Um, we haven't seen grocery prices come down. If anything, those are only going to be going up. Um, that's going to be the number one thing on voters' minds. And, although Trump isn't on the ballot, the way that they, display that displeasure is by voting, against Republicans or not coming out or, what have you. So this is going to have a very real impact, just on the economic level, but also, of course, we've also seen a fracturing of Trump's base because of this war. There is a very large chunk of, the MAGA base that does not agree with getting re-involved in the Middle East. And, it's looking like this is lasting weeks. There doesn't seem to be a clear way out. And that's concerning for a lot of people that voted for Trump and the wider Republican Party based on his promise to not get involved in forever wars anymore and focus on domestic issues. So absolutely, we definitely think there is a chance that Trump, tries to do maybe one more thing, bombs a certain place, just so he can declare unilateral victory. Because the longer this goes on, the more impact it's going to have for his party on the elections, and especially if there's any type of ground operations that begin, that will not make any voter happy, no matter what party. That's a very unpopular move in the US. So yeah, to sum up, absolutely. And I think that will be, heavily on Trump's mind. And I think that's why we are seeing, reports in the media that, he is, negotiating with Iran and what have you. That's usually a sign that, him and his team are looking for an off-ramp. So yeah, to sum up, that's what I would say.
So if you're going to look at things entirely from a domestic US point of view, what would you say would be the time frame? Would you say that he's willing to declare mission accomplished sooner rather than later with the midterms ahead? I mean, and when you say sooner rather than later, would you say days, weeks? Again, just purely from a domestic point of view.
Yeah, from a domestic point of view, I can't see this lasting longer than another 2, 3 weeks. Maybe a little bit longer than that, but I think, in our team, we've been talking about the fact that the US is hosting the World Cup in June, and that's not that far away. There's lots of discussions about security right now for that event. So I would say absolutely that would be like the latest. But even then, I don't see this dragging on much longer. I mean, Trump's approval ratings are the lowest they've ever been. So even, and he cares about that. He's not a guy that doesn't care about what the people are saying. So, the more unpopular he becomes, the more he's going to want to wrap this up. So, yeah, I would say 2 weeks. Maybe that's optimistic, but yeah, I would say that.
Okay, let's bring in Noam at this point. Now, okay, 2 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks. What would the Gulf allies think about that time frame?
That regard, I think we've seen reports of the inside, talks behind the scenes and talk on the public. So on the public, they want it to stop. In the off scene, but behind the scenes, we've heard them. We've heard a bit different kind of rhetoric. We've heard that indeed they do push for a bit more time for the war. From the understanding of whether when the war will end, Iran is unlikely to be fully beaten and fully incapable of having exerting influence in the region. They do understand that the longer the war continue, just in a bit, and that's what we are talking here, 2, 3 weeks, possibly 4 weeks, that will help to continue and degrade the capabilities of Iran further. So in that regard, from the Gulf countries, there are pressures of the economic pressures that are piling on. However, they are also realizing that later after the war, they'll have other kind of pressure of the security pressures, and the threat of Iran is not completely gone. As such, we are seeing that some kind of increasing support by the Gulf states for the conflict in terms of also engaging directly in the conflict. And as we said, if the conflict continue in the current trajectory, another 2, 3 weeks, it's possible that we will also see direct strikes or the direct involvement of the Gulf states in the conflict.
And do we give any credibility to the rumors that the Gulf states are trying to do perhaps off the wall things to get oil supplies out? There's been a few reports in newspapers about them trying to build an emergency road to get things out that bypasses the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, what are the contingency plans that the Gulf states are investigating to stop the Iranian blockade of Hormuz? And do we have any credibility in those?
Indeed. So in terms, if you're looking, we've seen initiatives or talks, not only with the Gulf, but also Europe, for example, having some kind of ships that securing the transit, coming together. This will be quite hard to continue in order to secure the safe passage. In terms of, however, of other things that we've seen so far of efforts to bypass the closure of Hormuz, we did see an increase of using land borders, basically oil shipments to UAE ports, and then crossing and then the oil crossed the border west to Saudi Arabia, up to Yanbu area, and then going from there with through the Red Sea, or crossing the border to Oman, looking at usually Sohar port, but also Salah and Dakhon port, also options. So this is kind of what we are seeing, some ways of bypassing. Another way that we did recognize some ships, I think it was the Qatari ships, I'm not sure if it was Qatar or UAE, that were crossing the strait without their radar systems on, without the identification system on. This is also kind of a point for them, a point that they're trying to pass without being recognized, and this is also a possibility that we cannot confirm, but there were some kind of dealings that Iran will allow those ships to pass. It's quite hard to confirm that regard. They are unlikely to admit or to confirm this in general. So those are kind of the two things that we are seeing: either they're trying to cross anyway, or trying to cross with Iranian agreement, or to cross through different land borders and then using the Red Sea. And this is also the issue that we are seeing right now with the addition of the Houthis to the conflict, but increasing the risk in the Red Sea, resumption of attacks. Although right now we don't see this happening in the coming days at least.
No, very good point. Okay, so in short, there's not much opportunity for any country to really break the stranglehold on the energy supplies. Okay, so moving forward, let's just say that Claire's right, and again, she's only seeing it from a domestic point of view, but let's just go with the 2 to 3 week timeline. Can you suggest how long it would take for business as usual, i.e. business before February the 28th to kick in, and for oil supplies, energy supplies, sulfur supplies, etc., to start ramping up back to normal levels? In other words, what degree of a longevity of disruption are we facing if things stop next 2 to 3 weeks? Are we looking at 6 months, a year? What are people in the Middle East thinking about in terms of return to pre-28th February levels of export?
Yes, indeed. I think in that regard, it will slowly get back to what it used to be. There'll still be implications. There'll still take some time for premiums, insurance premiums to go down. This will also impact some the prices and secondary prices. If you're looking, for example, on last year on the 12-day war, if looking on the oil prices, for example, we've seen that in about 2 days, 3 days, the oil prices kind of stabilized. And then we've also seen a resumption of transits about a week later. However, this war is more intense than, of course, from the 12 days war, and it's of course been much longer. So it's likely that we will see a slow pace of going back until there's a full security or full assessment or trust in the security in the area. And in that regard, we are looking at about 2 weeks to return of shipments completely. Slowly. And then again, to get the commodity, to get the oil from place to place will take another 1 week or 2 weeks. So overall, we are looking at a slow resumption that will take about 4 weeks to 5 weeks.
So if we are early April now, almost the 1st of April, and let's just say mission accomplished by the end of April, in inverted commas, we're still not going to see things resume to a more normal state till probably June.
Indeed, we will see that a slow resumption, but things will be still a bit shaky. There'll still be added costs, operation costs will be higher, and it will take some time.
And that, of course, assumes that the Iranians allow everyone to transit, even after mission accomplished has been declared.
Exactly.
So, yeah. So let's just quickly turn in the last few minutes now to sub-Saharan Africa and to Europe. Ed, let's start with you. That is quite a long time. That's basically another few months of work ahead of them, or restrictions ahead of them. Are we going to see a big impact on supply chain from exports from Africa, particularly minerals, if things go on like that, like Noam says, for the next couple of months? What's your analysis there? And bear in mind, we are talking about here a best case scenario, so this is everyone has to calibrate from that.
Sure. So I would say firstly that it will take once sort of we've assumed sort of business as normal, as we say, mission accomplished. The residual disruption that is going to face to these sort of mines based in Africa is going to take several weeks longer, because not only is it then a question of procuring then the products that you need to restart operations as they were pre-March, you're then going to have issues such as if you suddenly suspend operations at a mine, all of a sudden those workers may have to find alternate informal work. Those sort of big mechanized systems that you have that sort of underpin the mine's operations, those are going to take several weeks to come back to sort of full operational capacity. And then even then, once you restart production, again, it's restoring the functionality of export supply chains, where it be to regional ports or however those minerals essentially get to their end users. Quite often as well, one issue that we have for supply chains is that a lot of minerals that are mined in Africa, they are then exported elsewhere to be refined. So that sort of the whole supply chain process is even longer than it might be then in comparison to mining an identical product in Australia or parts of Southern America, where there's much more refining capacity. So I would say there would be residual delays for several weeks, possibly months. Again, that would depend sort of mineral specific, sector specific, depending on how critical the sort of import products that came into it were affected by the disruption in the Gulf.
Got it. And Karen, over to you in terms of the impact, the economic impact on Europe.
Yeah, so
given that best case scenario. Yeah.
Yeah, so in the best case scenario, I mean, for instance, if energy supplies is resumed, especially oil supplies through the Strait of Hormuz, this will clearly, in a couple of weeks, alleviate the pressures we're seeing across Europe. But I think when it comes to, for instance, other commodities, we're going to have, for instance, fertilizers. There'll still be lingering effects, especially as the impact is felt right now, given that the planting season has started. But broadly, what I'm going to say, what I mean over here is that it'll still take a couple of weeks and to normalize the economic situation. With in the longer term, we're going to still see an effect on inflation and the cost of living.
And if we're not looking at best case scenario, if this thing drags on for another few months, we're already seeing fuel supply interruptions in the UK and elsewhere in Europe. We can expect to see increased political pressure. But do you think that there's anything that Europe can do to ameliorate the situation for its citizens, above and beyond just forcing Trump to stop? I mean, there's not much leverage there. So what else can the European governments do to help in a non-best case scenario?
So in a non-best case scenario, that's a really good question. I mean, this is going to reinforce the debate about how to address, for instance, energy relationship with, for instance, Russia. There's some countries within the EU, namely Hungary and Slovakia, that are still importing energy, and especially oil, from Russia, even though that has been impacted over a couple of months for other reasons. But broadly, as pressure piles up on the population, there'll be a growing debate amongst European nations on whether or not to continue to apply these sanctions on Russia and Russian energy. Just for interest, the EU had to delay, given the war, a proposal to ban Russian oil fully until the 12th of April. This was a proposal supposed to be made in early March, but now it's pushed back to April. So this shows how this is also fragmenting the other side of the policies that Russia, the EU's posture regarding the Russia-Ukrainian war more broadly.
Great. Well, we've had a good 25 minutes or so of Q&A. I think we'll probably leave it there, unless anyone's got any last second questions. No, nothing through. Thank you very much to all my colleagues here, and excellent work from their analysis. And if you'd like to learn more about anything specific that you heard there, then please do feel free to get in touch. And on behalf of everyone at Sibline, thank you very much for joining. And here's hoping to a speedy resolution of this situation. Goodbye, everyone.